Hello, I'm David Hunt, CEO and founder of the Hyperion Cleantech Group and your host for the Leaders in Cleantech podcast. Now, I've been really looking forward to today's episode. It's something a little bit different from usual, as I have with me someone who is a physicist, oceanographer, canoeist, bubble enthusiast, TV and radio presenter, many things. Helen Czerski. Helen, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
It's great to have you join us. Want to talk about many things today. The thing that, again, really drew me, the audience will know I'm a big solar fan. And when I saw that you had a book which was related to a gigantic solar-powered machine, of course, I had to dive into it. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But jumping into that intro, clearly you do and have done and continue to do many things. Of those many, physicist, oceanographer, scientist, TV radio presenter, author, TED speaker, many things. Where and what are you doing when you're most comfortable and happy?
I am quite hard to label. It's true. But actually what I love is the variety. And, I'm anchored as an academic physicist. That's how I identify, I guess. But actually the joy of it, like the world is full of curiosity and interesting things. And I've been lucky enough to be able to connect to lots of those things. And actually the biggest joy for me is making those connections and synthesizing the ideas that come from it. So I'm happy in lots of places. It's like it's kind of like wearing different hats, right? You have a wardrobe full of hats. Which hat do you feel like today? And it's the variety that keeps me interested more than anything else. And they are all linked, but it is, it's sort of how things work and how the world works, and thinking about our planet is kind of the anchor, and then everything else is just all the human fun that comes on top of that.
Yeah. Now, I've been talking about that with my wife reading the book, and because I'm innately curious about many things, and as the audience will know, very much a nerd around most things around technology and scientific endeavours. But one thing that came across from the book is not just how clearly enthused and passionate you are about the science, but how it's almost like, as you say, it's just kind of a facet of everything else that's going on. And some of your anecdotes are just as entertaining and/or demonstrate such a level of passion that's equal to the science, if you like. And as you say, it's kind of just a part of life that's not one-dimensional.
Well, I'm very much a fan of, a lot of the work I do is in connecting society to science, and a lot of those connections come because it's not actually separate. And really, if you just look, we're sort of taught at school that you have your science classes, and then the next time you have English class, and they're completely separate. And of course, it's not true. That you can see science in everything we do. And actually, the most important thing that I think I can offer in some senses is a perspective. Like, knowing lots of science isn't about knowing lots of facts, but understanding how the world works gives you a perspective on it. And I think that's the really valuable thing. It's really having the luxury, and of course that's with the presenting and writing and that kind of stuff. Often what I'm doing is taking a situation, and my job is really to say, what does this mean? What does it really mean? And also to connect that to us all being human, because I think we often separate those two things. We think we have to be a professional person who does these professional things and wears a shirt or whatever it is, dresses in a certain way, behaves in a certain way. There's no reason for that to be true, right? That's entirely a human construct. And there is no reason why you can't do brilliant science or be a brilliant business leader while being a human being. And actually, the most important business and science, I think, is done as human beings. Because the problem is otherwise we turn ourselves into machines. Mm-hmm. And we want to live in a human world, not in I want to live in a human world. If we just wanted to optimize everything, if efficiency was the only point, we would just switch ourselves off and let the robots get on with it, right? And efficiency is clearly not the point.
No, exactly. And you made that point in the book that, it could effectively get, I'd actually say, more efficient results in handing everything over to AI and or robots. But actually, it's the human connection that actually makes sense of everything, or it's everything that makes sense as a human.
Yes, and I don't think we should be shy about that. And it's one of the things, as a sort of broader way, in the clean tech world especially, I think this is a question that comes up because, there's that saying about you can't fix a problem using the same thinking that was used to create it. And I think a lot of the time, not pointing fingers anywhere in specifically, but I can kind of see that, you see big venture capitalists, you see these big systems that got to where they are through making money because they could make money. And then they're claiming they can apply that same thinking to fixing the problem. And actually that is not the case, I think. And we need to be honest about, thinking more broadly about the value of being human and what we can do, and actually thinking about our planet and what we value. And it's not just about the sort of mechanisms that have always made business turn, because that is just going to, it doesn't matter what you claim your solution is, if you use that same thinking that the earth is there to extract things from, that, you know, there's a kind of linear model that we just take and take and take and take and take, and we never think about how we interact with the system, then of course it doesn't matter what you claim your solution is, you're just going to create more problems. And I think a large part of this is understanding the planet well enough to see how we can fit in with it, because otherwise you're running up the down escalator, right? We live on a planet that has loads of materials. It's got loads of energy. They're flowing around all around us. Materials are being recycled all around us. If we don't fit in with that, we're always going to be going against the grain, right? We're always going to be causing problems for ourselves. But change that mindset involves humility, looking at a planet and saying, how do we fit in, instead of looking at a piece of ground and saying, how do I use that? You know, those are two, and I think it's a shift in mindset that's needed. And along with that comes humanity, like the humility to be human. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And from my perspective, I spend a lot of my time, as you may well know, with, you know, startups within the clean technology environment. And again, it's very different, and we encourage that level of self-awareness. It's very different from just repeating the very corporate ways of going about business, which are very around efficiency and exploitation rather than again, problem solving. That's not to say all corporates are bad, of course, but it's just a different mindset and a different way of thinking, and I get that. So let's look at the present book. I know you're doing a bit of a book tour at the moment, and so it was my inner geek that immediately jumped on it as soon as I saw that it was being published. But perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what led you. I know you're an ocean scientist and oceanographer, but what led you specifically to address the topic in this way?
Well, so the book is called Blue Machine, and it's about how the ocean works. And the first response I often get is, well, I didn't know the ocean worked, right? We have this perception that the ocean is just this kind of big void and it's not really doing anything. And, you know, it's just sort of gets in the way a bit. And of course, that's nonsense. The ocean is an engine. It's part of our planet. It's a critical part of how our planet functions. And it's doing things. And there's this physical engine underneath that is doing things all the time. And of course, we feel the influence of that. You know, humans have kind of floated about on the top, and every so often they'll say, oh, look, you know, some seaweed has popped up here, or oh, look, there's lots of fish over here. And it's not random. It's not that nature kind of rolls a dice today and today there are fish. It's that the ocean engine is turning underneath, and a part of that mechanism has brought the right conditions to the surface, so then you get lots of fish. So we sort of treat the ocean as though it was this kind of empty, sort of fickle, random place where strange things happen. And actually, it's much, much more important than that. And I came to the ocean, you know, all my degrees are in physics. I was doing physics research, and I was going to change topic, and I knew that. So I ended up in the world of bubbles, which took me to the world of breaking waves. And I rocked up at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I understood my lab. You know, it had tanks and pipes and pumps, and I could do all the physics. And there was this thing by the door, this kind of frame, that, you know, sort of the size of the height of a person, maybe 2 or 3 meters on the side. And people were sort of fussing over it. I didn't know what it was. And then one day they opened the door and they carried this thing out, and they carried it down to the beach, into the waves. And I understood that it was their gateway to another world. And up to that point, and I was probably 26 then, 27, no one had talked to me about the ocean. Right. No one had ever mentioned it. And, you know, I mean, you know, I'd been that kid that read all the New Scientist and the science magazines, and I was the little, you know, no one had mentioned the ocean. And as soon as I saw it, like, I was like, this is ludicrous. This is clearly the biggest story on Earth. So, you know, I went along and I sort of joined the ocean world. And I did a lot of thinking about why it is that we don't talk about the ocean. You know, the Apollo missions went to the moon. They took these photographs, Earthrise and the blue marble. And they said, oh, we're a blue planet. And then we didn't look at the blue. We just went, oh, it's blue. Right. Job done. And actually, which is weird, we've had 50 years of calling ourselves a blue planet, and all we think that is in there is the fish. And pretty fish are very nice. I have nothing against pretty fish, but it's not the point of the ocean. And I think the thing is that almost the problem with the ocean is it touches so many areas of our lives, and it's so big, and it turns in so many different ways. It does little things and big things, and it does slow things and fast things. And actually, I think the reason we don't talk about it is because it's like the 3 blind men and the elephant. You know, there's this ancient story that one man puts his hand out and feels the trunk and says, oh, an elephant is like a snake. And one puts his hand on the leg and says, oh, an elephant is like a tree. And the thing is that they're all true, right? And it's the same with the ocean. All these things are true. All these different perspectives are true. But you sort of have to tell lots of little stories to build up the picture of what the ocean really is. And that's the privilege that you have in a book, that you can tell these stories of how the ocean has influenced history and culture and lots of different animals. And you can say why, like it was turning in this particular way here. And it had this consequence for us. And then it turns in this other way over here, and it has this consequence for this animal. And you can tell those stories. And I think after a while, you start to build up this picture of what the ocean is. And ocean scientists kind of carry that around in their head, but they sort of take it for granted. And so it's hard to say that in a sentence. You know, if someone puts you down, points a microphone at you, what is the ocean in 2 minutes? Basically, all you can say is it's a giant pool of water, which is true, but entirely misses the point. And so that's what the book is. It's a set of stories from all periods of history and everywhere in the animal kingdom, and it shows how the ocean is different and how this engine works and why it matters.
I think why it matters is important, because I always kind of knew, had this innate sense that the ocean was important. It affected the atmosphere and weather and all this kind of stuff. But also it was the thing where you went and threw stones in and sort of did a bit of paddling when it was holiday time and stuff. So is it because it is so complex that it doesn't tend to get the attention it deserves? Or to one of your points, which I know annoys you, and you state in the book, it's kind of this, we know more about the moon than the earth, than the bottom of the ocean kind of stuff, which is it that element of it is so complex and therefore it's best or easiest just not to dive in, if you forgive the pun?
Well, so on the complexity thing, the thing about the ocean is that it's lots of simple ideas. The thing that makes it complex is they're all kind of on top of each other. So it's not too hard. I don't want to discourage people from thinking about the ocean because they think it's too complex. It's complex in an interesting way. There are these big patterns that all sit on top of each other. So it's not that it's too hard to understand. I do think that humans quite like having a void. You know, there's all these poets and writers who've looked out over the ocean, and the ocean's kind of a convenient void, right? You can see it. It's not like the sky. You can kind of poke it and touch it and dabble your toes in it, and then you can look out over it and admire this great mystery, because humans do like having a mystery. And so I sort of see the attraction of, the ocean as this great mystery. But the problem is that at the stage we're at, we don't have the luxury of treating this part of an ocean engine, of the planetary engine, as a sort of convenient toy, because we're changing it. And our actions are changing it, and it in turn is going to come back and bite us, frankly, And so I think, there's a famous Richard Feynman quote, well, it's sort of just a story he tells about an artist telling him that, oh, well, you physicists, you scientists, you take a flower and it's this beautiful thing and you turn it into something boring. And Feynman says no, because actually when you really look at a flower, isn't it fascinating? You see all these things, it gets even more beautiful. Yeah. And I think it's like that with the ocean, that maybe if we all genuinely lived a long way from land and we were all not polluting and not causing problems everywhere, maybe the ocean could stay as this nice mysterious void. But actually, it's a part of our world, and it's such a it actually defines the way we live on Earth more than anything else. If any alien life came to Earth and looked, it would see what we saw, which is that we are a blue planet. And it would see that the ocean is the thing that dictates how everything else works. It dictates, what the weather is like, how the atmosphere works, what kind of plants you can have on land in different places, how heat moves around the earth, where nutrients go. That's the interesting bit, right? The land stuff is just the consequences. So I do think that and it is hard to see. The other thing about the ocean is there's no doubt that at the moment, if you don't know anything about the ocean, you're looking over the top of it or looking in the rock pools about as close as you get. But now we have much more knowledge, and we have the technology that can show us the perspective. And that's the reason I'm really hopeful about us seeing the ocean differently, is that we're starting to get, even on, Google Earth now, or Google Earth Pro, or whatever it's called, you can zoom out and you can see the depths, you can see the shape to the bottom of the ocean, you can see what's going on. And we can see that the ocean isn't just an empty space that we can fill up, because that's my other as you have pointed out, I have many bees in my bonnet, but one of them is that humans see empty space and they just think, oh, well, it's not worth anything unless humans fill it up, so we better fill it up with something. And it's nonsense, right? But it comes from not appreciating that there is an engine that is already turning, that's already benefiting us hugely in what it's doing now. And perhaps we can put things in it, but we probably ought to know what it's doing first and try and fit in with that, rather than just treating it as an empty space that we can just expand into, because that's what humans seem to like doing.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point, that it isn't innate. And it's not therefore just something that's irrelevant. Some of the anecdotes again you talk about throughout history, where historical impacts have been I guess affected by ocean related topics or what's going on underneath the water, and the fact that it isn't innate, it is so integral to everything that happens above. On land, so to speak, there's no area above land that isn't affected by what's going on in the ocean, and I think that's not always a thing that we connect.
Well, and it works the other way around. And I think one of the things that's happened in the past is unintended consequences. Humans have thought, oh, well, the ocean is so big, we can't possibly affect it. So I will just tell briefly one of the stories in the book, which I think is a lovely example. I mean, it's terrible and lovely at the same time as an example of unintended consequences. But sound is really important in the ocean. So actually sound and light are kind of switched over. So sound is the long distance messenger underwater. Light doesn't travel very far. And it's really important to a lot of ocean animals. And so I got to go last summer to the Natural History Museum down into the basement to look at their stores of whale earwax, which is a real thing. Brilliant. Whales genuinely have earwax. The reason they have earwax is that they evolved from land mammals that were about the size of dogs, had ears similar to ours. And when that species moved into the ocean, the sticky out ears caused drag, so they kind of evolved out and just was smoothed away. And the whales started hearing through their jaws, which is actually how we hear. When you put your head underwater, the sound isn't going down your ears, it's through the bones of your skull. So the whales didn't need, the sound was coming through their skull, so they didn't need the hole. So the hole was kind of sealed over with skin. The tube stayed there because evolution's messy, just leaves things behind. And the earwax kept being formed, and it just kind of pushed up the tube. And you get this, every whale has this kind of tube of layers of earwax going back to when it was born. And so it's kind of like tree rings. You've got this record of earwax going back the length, the history, throughout the life of the whale. And scientists from the Natural History Museum and the American Museum of Natural History worked out, and this is the next brilliant bit, they worked out that between them they had lots of whale earwax, and they knew when the whales died. And that meant they knew the time that each whale earwax plug matched to. And of course whales live for decades, but they had lots of earplugs. So they, between them, assembled a 150-year record of whale earwax, global whale earwax, just amazing, going back to 1870. And then they monitored stress, the stress hormone cortisol. And you can totally see there are periods when the global whale population is really stressed, and it's when humans are hunting them, the more whales killed goes up. So that's kind of the background. And then there's this anomaly. This is the interesting bit, that during the Second World War, humans stopped killing whales and focused on killing each other. So you think, well, the whales are having a great time. And they weren't. There is a very distinctive spike in the stress during the Second World War of global whales. And the reason for it is the noise that humans were generating, were bombing things, ships, torpedoes, destroyers, all this kind of stuff, generating a huge amount of noise, and it was stressing the whales out. And so at that point, sonar had barely been invented at that point. Humans did not know how to deliberately send sound into the water, and yet our sound was having unintended consequences, stressing out the whales. And most of the book is happy stories about how the ocean works. There's a bit at the end about the problems, but it's that sort of thing where whether or not we think we're interacting with the ocean, we have there is an interaction going on. And so that sort of being that awareness that actually we always touch it.
Yeah.
So we might as well try and touch it well, rather than just ignoring it and accidentally causing damage.
Yeah, which invariably happens. So obviously, we haven't got time to go through the whole book, and I'm generally not getting paid for this. It is a brilliant book, and it's kept me entertained for quite some hours so far, and I'm not quite finished. But one of the things I think which is interesting, thinking of our audience who are very much geared towards using technology to better preserve the earth and the environment and society. So one of the areas obviously which gets a lot of I guess airtime is the Arctic and the Antarctic. And what fascinated me was looking at that part where you think that they are actually the importance in some regards is some way inverse to their size in relation to the ocean as a whole. Perhaps you could just share a little bit why the polar regions are just so fundamentally important.
So the poles are very small. So the Arctic Ocean, I think, in terms of surface area, is something like 1.3% of the global ocean. And so you might think, well, if a bit of sea ice comes and goes there, what difference does it make? Because it's only 1.3%. But the ocean is this engine, and that means it's got different parts of the engines are doing different things. And one of the things that the polar oceans do very specifically is generate cold, salty, dense water that can slides out into the rest of the deep ocean. And that kind of is the biggest part of the ocean engine, is this overturning circulation where dense water sinks to the bottom and it slides around the planet over hundreds of years, and then eventually it comes back to the surface. So people sometimes call it the ocean conveyor belt, but it's driven by the polar regions. And also the polar regions that then have an effect on the atmosphere. So the way the atmospheric circulation, the jet stream, for example, is driven by a temperature difference between the poles and the area to the south. So people may know the jet stream is that fast kind of atmospheric flow of air that comes from the west towards the east. It carries storms across to us here in the UK. But it's kind of like that. It's like that flowing river of air is kind of a boundary between the cold to the north and the cooler, the warmer stuff to the south. And the bigger that temperature difference, the faster it flows. So and that, for that it needs to be cold. The ice keeps it cold counterintuitively because it sort of stops the heat escaping, and it prevents it absorbing more heat. And so those parts of the global engine, the reason we hear so much about them is not just that they're precious and different, although they are. It's that they are drivers of the global engine. And if you take them away, the rest of the engine, the way the rest of the engine functions changes. And so everything is interconnected. There's this wonderful map called the Spillhouse projection. It's actually on the front of the book where, we always have this problem when we want to have a flat map of a spherical object. You have to kind of distort it somehow. And Spillhouse said something very fundamental. He said that in order to see the land, we always cut the ocean. So in order to see the ocean, we must cut the land. And so the point is that and if you do that, then you see that the whole ocean is connected, that the whole thing is a single engine. And you have to kind of deprioritize us a bit to see it. And then once you see it, then you can put your worldview back together with that in mind, and see that it is all connected, all these different components inside, because the water is not the same everywhere. It's got anatomy. The ocean has anatomy, and those components are moving around each other. And so then you can start to see how the movement of those components in the ocean is affecting what happens to us on land.
Yeah. Looking at, I guess, what drives many of us in pushing towards renewable sources of power to stop burning fossil fuels and start addressing some of the issues that we're doing to the planet and indeed the oceans. The ocean is so full of such phenomenal power. I think that's clear to everybody, and even more so after, obviously, further exploration, just in terms of how much energy the ocean absorbs. But why is it so difficult for us as humans to harness that for meaningful power? You look at most sort of hydropower, it's from dams rather than directly from the ocean, where a lot of the energy obviously is stored. So are there particular reasons, do you see, that why it's so difficult for us to actually harness that energy?
Yeah, so there's the deep physics reason, and then there's some of the others. And actually, we're just about to do some of this for Fully Charged, actually, to cover some of these topics. The deeply, so you are correct that the ocean is a massive store of energy, mostly heat energy, but also some kinetic energy. But the reason it's not directly, so there's a difference which we don't hear discussed actually in the clean tech world. There's a difference between energy and useful energy, because so say you have a lukewarm pool of water, and it's definitely got energy in it because it's not at 0 degrees centigrade, right? Or it's not 0 Kelvin. So it's definitely got energy because it's not at absolute zero. But that energy, if it's the coolest thing in the room, it's not going to warm anything else up. It's not useful energy. So basically, the problem with the vast amount of energy in the ocean is it's kind of, a lot of it is kind of like that. It's either heat energy, which is relatively cool. So, and it's all, you can't generate a temperature difference in most places enough to actually extract some useful energy. And in practice, what happens to that energy is it's just radiated slowly away into space. It's kind of low-grade energy that just leaks out of the system back out into space. So, and the kinetic, again, with the movement energy, it's moving generally very slowly, and it's not worth extracting. So there is huge energy there because the ocean is very big, but on a local level, you've only got it's moving relatively slowly, most of it. So the problem with the energy in the ocean is that it's low grade energy. It's what you need to keep a planet running, but humans want to move faster than that. So you need either a big temperature difference or a really fast flow. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that So there are, well, the ocean is a very corrosive environment, right? We don't think about salt being a corrosive thing because we all have it in our kitchens, and we don't think of ourselves as keeping, toxic, nasty things in our kitchens. But actually, the ocean is phenomenally salty. Like if you wanted to make a bath, a standard household bath as salty as the ocean, you would have to put most of a big bucket of salt in it. It's a lot of salt. And of course, things live in the ocean. 61% of the life in the ocean, around 60%, is too small for us to see with the naked eye. But it's all there in the water. So if you put something in there, all that life is going to, be nosing around, growing on it, using it as a substrate. And then, of course, water is extremely heavy, which means that if you want to get to things or maintain them, you've not only got to deal with going down into the depths, you've got to deal with moving all this water about, which is extremely expensive in other types of energy. And and then there's this thing, I think, where, and in some places, like Orkney is a good example, you get tidal flows that are focused in a very narrow region. So you have a narrowing, and then you've got a huge amount of water to move through it, which would go very slowly, except it's only got small gaps, so it has to go very quickly. So places like that, you do get tidal energy out. And then the other thing actually is effects on the ecosystem. I mean, this is the reason why a lot of tidal barrages don't get off the ground. It's because you can't just cut off a river from the ocean and assume it's going to be okay. Enormous amounts of life come and go up estuaries. So I live next to the Thames in London, and upstream of the city, and there are endangered species going past my, it looks brown. No one would think anything was in there. It's got the European eel going up and down it. Something like 70% of the sea bass in the North Sea go through their juvenile stages in the Thames. They go past where I live in central London. And so if you just cut off if you cut off an estuary with a tidal barrage, you can do enormous damage to biodiversity. And then the final thing, I mean, there's a whole list, and it's because the ocean is interesting, but the final thing is sediment. So things in the ocean move, and the solid parts of the ocean, the kind of sandy bits, also move. And so if you put something on the seafloor, for example, the laws of fluid dynamics mean that sand will either get scoured away from the side of it or pile up on top of it, depending on what's going on. So it's a really difficult environment to work in. But I would also caution, we come back to this point about it's not just an empty space for us to fill up. So I think, it looks like there's lots of energy, but I think we have to be really careful that we're not sort of doing things without understanding the natural environment that's already there. It's not empty space. Anyone who tells you that the ocean is empty and therefore it doesn't matter is lying. Basically, they're lying or they're ignorant. And so it's really important that we look at it with a different attitude and say, well, let's understand what it's doing. And then, yes, perhaps there are places where tidal energy might work or wave energy might work. But we have to think about very carefully what impact that has on the ocean and what impact the ocean would have on that infrastructure.
Yeah.
And it's not straightforward. And of course, the ocean is mostly inaccessible. So you then got to get whatever it is back to land. And also, I mean, to some extent, and then I'll stop on this point. But to some extent, I think something we don't often think about enough is that when we move into the ocean, it's often an admission of failure of our systems on land, right? Because if we could actually manage ourselves on land, we wouldn't need to go out into the ocean. And I think we're almost at the point now where we need to start asking ourselves hard questions about, it's like the kid who wants to go out and play in the playground before they've tidied up their bedroom, right? You're like, you tidy up your bedroom first, and then you might be allowed to go and mess up somebody else's environment. And I think that, we need to think about, if we can't make our systems on land work, where is our evidence for thinking we can do better in the ocean? I think we need to kind of prove to ourselves that we can do better on land in a lot of cases, offshore wind being the obvious exception, before we move out into the ocean.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting perspective, as you say, and it's very much an interconnected world. I've been watching quite avidly over many years, decades, in fact, looking at the Mersey as a source of power, because it has like a 10-meter range and all these other sort of hugely beneficial elements, but also the complexities of some of which you've touched on. So let's move a little bit on to you, Helen. So what led you, I should say, you didn't start as an oceanographer. What led you first to bubbles? Because that seemed to be your road into the oceans.
So my PhD work involved using high-speed cameras to watch things explode. And what I was good at was building experiments to get at difficult things in awkward places. And so I used a lot of high-speed photography before CMOS sensors came along. So this is before you could do it digitally. And actually still, the cameras we use now, a lot of them would still hang, like old film high-speed cameras hold up they're slow to use. You can't take lots of pictures, but the quality is still far better than most of what you get out of most digital high-speed cameras today. So I learned to do that, to take awkward photographs of small things that were happening too fast to see in dangerous environments. And I didn't want to carry on blowing things up. I'd never really wanted to do it. I just liked the experiments. And so when I finished my PhD doing that, I looked around for a topic that was sort of this messy physics in the middle, awkward things that were moving, that were small and too fast to see. And it just so happened that there had been a bubbles lab in my as part of a PhD lab, run by the son of Ernest Walton, who split the atom, or Cockcroft, who split the atom. No, it was Walton's son who was there. Anyway, and they said, well, maybe you want to go and. So I think they'd invited someone to give a seminar, and I just kind of followed that and wrote an email to this guy, Grant Dean at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and said, well, I'm good at physics. I've got all these degrees from Cambridge and a PhD, and I don't know anything about bubbles. Can I come and work for you? And he said yes, for which I owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. And so I kind of followed my nose. And I'd thought about doing geology along the way. I was interested in how the world works. I've been an environmental campaigner since I was 10, basically. I was that annoying kid. And I'd never found a way to do it which was deep enough, because physics really tells you how things work, and on a really deep level, and everything else seemed to be a bit superficial. And then, so I feel very fortunate that they've kind of come around together, and I can do physics in a natural environment, and that's where it all comes around. And I've had, I'm a seagoing oceanographer. I work on ships, research ships out in the open ocean. And I've had the privilege of working on many of the world's oceans in different environments, in big storms, because that's what I study. And what I'm studying is how the ocean breathes. So it's relevant to the carbon cycle, because, when there's a big storm out at sea, it's effectively the ocean taking a deep breath. And we still don't understand all of the details of that process, but it's exactly in my wheelhouse, right? Mm-hmm. Awkward, small things happening too fast to see in horrible conditions. That's just my account. It's just my cup of tea. So I'm a associate professor at University College London doing that, and I still do everything else. I work with a fully charged show, and it's actually really interesting covering energy and transport for them, because I think that dual perspective is very useful. Seeing the planet at the same time as seeing the local problem. That's a very interesting place to be. So I do all these other things because I'm a fidget.
Apart from being a fidget, I think and again, people like yourself who are scientists, who are able to inform and educate in an accessible way, whether it's through TV and obviously media that accesses the general public much more so. Was that a conscious decision for you to find a way to make science more accessible to a broader public, or was that an accident? How did that come about?
It's entirely an accident. And actually, what I tend to find, and I still think this is largely true, and the world of social media is kind of doing interesting things to this, but certainly back then, if you were the one who desperately wanted to be on TV, you were not ever going to do a good job. And it was almost an automatic thing that ruled you out. Because if you cared more about it being yourself than about the story you were telling, you're in the wrong place doing the wrong thing. So I was at an oceanography. I was a postdoc in oceanography in Rhode Island in the States. They just wanted to make a video to put on their website. They videoed me talking about the bubbles in a bottle of lemonade. soda. And the BBC at the time, sometime later, actually some months later, was looking for a presenter, and they found that video, and they invited, I think it's the only time they've ever done it, I think they invited 64 people, I was later told, to sort of audition. And I was like, yeah, whatever, these people talk, fine. And then that I sort of emerged at the end of that process without ever really trying, and that was the series Orbit. But I think the things that I had going in my favour, apart from not caring at all about TV, was having a broad knowledge of the world and a broad interest in it, but also really caring about the science. You've got to get the science right. And the thing I find with TV producers and mostly executives, commissioning editors, is that they're always nervous to trust that the real world is more exciting than anything they can imagine. Like, there's this tendency to go, no, we have to make it like this, because if it's not the biggest thing or it's not the best thing, then it's just not interesting. And you're like, I guarantee you can give me, and because I've actually done this, I did years ago on Twitter. I said to people, send me the most boring, for an advent calendar, I said, send me the most boring picture you can find of the world, and I will find an interesting bit of science in it. And then we did one with the Cosmic Shambles Network, we did one every day for all of December. But the point is, it's always more interesting. There are always stories there. Always, always, always. And it takes a bit of skill and experience and confidence to look for them. But those links are always there. But you've got to really know the science quite deeply to spot them sometimes. But they are always there, and the world is always a fascinating place. And I think we need to give it more credit. People are so busy trying to kind of manipulate things and shape things and curate things, and you're like, just look at the interesting thing and let it be interesting, because it's always better than you thought it was going to be. I wrote a column, I have a science column for the Wall Street Journal. I wrote a column 3 days ago on why owls are all fluff, right? I don't know if you ever held an owl on your wrist, but there's nothing there. Like, stonking great big owl that is 30 centimeters taller than that, 30 centimeters tall, quite broad, weighs a kilogram, nothing there, it's all fluff. And there is a reason for that, and there's a physics reason for that. And it's like, you don't have to go far to find interesting things. You just have to be prepared to be humble and let nature show you what it's got to show you.
How do we draw this curiosity? This is something, obviously, as a parent of both university and younger ages, that level of curiosity and towards, not necessarily always has to be a career in STEM or to follow STEM necessarily, although I think clearly we do need a lot of work to address there. But how do we make sure, because I think that if people have a general greater awareness of the world, we just treat it better. It's like if you know someone, you're much more likely to treat them well than if they're a complete stranger. I think that's a human trait. So I think if we know the world a little bit more about how it works, we're a little bit more cognizant of just our impact on it and how to treat it. So are there ways that you feel that we can and should be as a society and through education? Big question now, I guess, but it wasn't intended to be a big question. But what can we do to make sure that people are much more engaged with our environment, so we can be better understanding, so we can be better stewards of the planet?
The first thing is to play. Adults have this thing where we tend to think playing is for kids, right? And so as an adult, generally, people will pass a thing and they go, oh, that's a strange thing on that wall. And then they forget about it. They put their adult blinkers on, and then they carry on and forget about the weird thing on the wall. And it's a really bad habit. But we're sort of told, we have to be serious people now, and we have to think about serious things, and we're not going to think about the weird thing on the wall. And whereas a kid will go, why is that blue? And you see parents trying to answer these questions, right? And I don't know, that's in my category of things that I do not think about. So I think the first thing is, and so quite often, and I was very fortunate, my parents would say, oh, I don't know, let's go and find out. Or let's plant it and see what grows. And I think that not being afraid, there's a really fundamental thing about not being afraid just to look at the world and think that why is a really good question. And it's not always that you're going to find an answer, but that habit of understanding there is a question. Maybe I can't. Eventually, my mother said to me, I don't know, you go away to university and find out and come back and tell me. And I don't think she realised quite what she was letting herself in for. But so I think the first thing is, it's a serious point. We need to play with the world. There's a demonstration. I encourage everyone to do this next time you've got a teacup or a coffee mug with a chunky-ish handle. Get a spoon, tap it all the way around the rim, right? You'll hear that the pitch changes as you tap it tap around the outside of the rim. And you can do that at a dinner party. People sometimes think you're trying to propose a toast. But the point is, wouldn't it be great if adults showed each other those things? Because at the moment, what happens is I show people those things and they go, oh, I have to go and tell my kids. And I'm like, fine, tell your kids, but also tell your boss, tell the person in the shop, like, let's all talk about these things because the world is interesting. So I think just accepting that, being able to play with the world is what makes it interesting. And then, of course, the big debate at the moment is how we use the benefits of the online world alongside the real world. Because I care very much about, future generations not treating the world as a computer game that they just see through a simulation. But you don't want to cut off the online world because that's how you learn, right? If you don't know what the thing on the wall is, you can probably get an app that will take a photograph of it and tell you, right? You can find out. And so I think this question of how do we really root ourselves in the real world with real experiences and things that sometimes make us uncomfortable, at the same time as sharing knowledge, proper knowledge, not sort of the deep fake stuff in the online world. And I think that's the great challenge, because it's the opportunity, so when I was growing up, perhaps if a girl wanted to learn, I don't know, woodwork or something, she would have to walk into a woodwork class with all the boys, right? Whereas now she can watch a YouTube video and she doesn't have to walk into an environment where she looks different. And so these are important learning tools, but we also need to make sure they're rooted in the real world. And then there's all, there's plenty of serious sort of serious answers about opportunity cost, because the more comfortable, if you have to worry about where your next meal is coming from or where you're going to live, you don't have the capacity to think about these things. So obviously there's all of that kind of stuff. But really, I think not being afraid to ask why, and not this habit. And I think it's interesting. So I'm not a business person. So, I'm sure business people will tell me that the thing I'm about to say is very naive. But my perception of what is seen as success in the business world is that there's this attitude, especially in the tech bro Silicon Valley thing, that you can kind of make it true. If you are committed enough to your idea and you convince enough people that widget X is going to change the world, then probably widget X will change the world because you just convinced enough people that it's true, right? But in the world of science, if someone says that, this plant works like this, someone else does the experiment and says, well, no, it doesn't. And no amount of belief and publicity and whatever, just doesn't work like that. And so I think that humility that comes with being faced with the natural world, I think a bit more of that would probably be beneficial in the tech world. This idea that we want to appreciate, accept that sometimes nature has done it first and done it better. And we can use that rather than we're going to stomp all over it and make it true because our egos tell us that this is how a venture capitalist makes money or something like that.
Yeah, I think there's an element of in that again around people's ability to say I don't know. And I think going back to the business world, I think there's certainly changes, and we've seen, and I've seen changes over the last few years, where there's now an acceptance, particularly in leadership, of saying I just don't know the answer and let's find out. But I think there's still some kind of self-limiting belief that we can't not know. So therefore we have to not talk about it because we don't know about it, or we shout about it and about something which is incorrect, but we shout the loudest and therefore people stop talking to us. So I think linked to what you're saying about playing is also just the ability to say, I just don't know the answer, and then feel uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, and the ability to step back from an idea when someone tells you it's a bad one. that's because I think a lot of, and we see this actually, so I do some work, and certainly my colleagues do, in the world, people who think that they can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the ocean. And there's a whole separate debate about that, which we probably don't have time to get into. But the point is that it looks to us, to the scientists, like a lot of the people who are proposing these ideas don't actually care about removing carbon from the atmosphere. What they care about is having a business model that generating some IP that they can sell to somebody else. And they don't care about whether it scales or whether it harms the fish or whether it causes all these other problems. All they want is to get to the point where they've got this piece of IP and they sell it on. And there's this kind of like the commitment to ideas. If you told them, this idea, you're going to have to stick with this for the rest of your life, I think they would think differently about it. but they see it as a short-term thing rather than a long-term thing. Like, they're not invested in the long term of it, I guess, is what I'm saying. There is like, oh, just make a thing and move on. And the world doesn't have space for people who are just going to make a thing and move on anymore.
Yeah. No, I'd say that there certainly are some people who are wedded to an idea for its commerciality or other reasons, and won't listen to anything alternative. And there are all of those things at the moment. Hydrogen's a big one, obviously, that you know they'll address. But again, from my experience, and I've worked with startups in clean tech for 10 years or more, I think a lot of people do generally want to solve problems and are willing to learn and iterate as they go along. But there certainly is, I think, where too much money or too much corporate thinking comes in, it becomes maybe a little bit more as you suggest. One thing I'd like to do, again, I say we can't go through the entire book or talk physics all day, but so I want to talk a little bit about yourself and your career. And one of the things that came up was I did a little bit of thing within the Hyperion team around some quick fire questions, if I may. So firstly, one that came through was, which is the most remote place remote from land, that is, that you've ever been?
It's either the North Pole or the middle of the North Atlantic. It's probably just the North Pole, I think. Yes, just thinking about in terms of which ships I've been on where.
Okay.
So technically, obviously, the North Pole has ice, but it's not got land.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing was that you talked about on the North Atlantic there, and again, there's a lot of news certainly in the UK and Europe at the moment about the temperature, or in particular of the North Atlantic and then the seas around the UK. What's the shortest version of what's going on, and should we be worried?
So the marine heat wave is, I think, some parts of the sea around, certainly around the coast of Britain, are about 5 degrees hotter than they should be. And this is in June. It was in June, right? Those headlines start coming out. So that's before the hottest part of the summer. So the reasons for it are sort of lots of things lining up. Climate change sits underneath a lot of them, but then there's these big cycles in the weather where sometimes it gets a bit hotter and sometimes it gets a bit colder, and a few of those have lined up. So basically it's a combination of a warming planet because of climate change, and then a few of these big cycles to do with El Nino and the atmosphere and ocean in the Atlantic. A few of those have lined up on the warmer side, and now you've got a marine heat wave. And yes, it absolutely matters, because lots of marine ecology can't cope with higher temperatures and will move, disrupt ecosystems, and it generally causes a lot of damage to life. So yes, we should be concerned about it.
Yeah, that sort of thing, and it's unrelated. I think it was in Texas actually, with the huge shoals of dead fish sweeping over. This, I guess, this is around both temperature and oxygen within the water.
So in Texas, so the outflow of the Mississippi River is, so basically there's huge amounts of our agriculture. So that river drains a gigantic proportion of the central part of North America, and people farm. The fertilizers get washed into the river, they get carried out into the Gulf of Mexico, and then they cause an enormous bloom. Lots of life grows because there's fertilizer, but then other things come and eat it, and they use up all the oxygen, and the oxygen can't get replenished quickly enough. And it's known as a dead zone, and it grows and shrinks in the Gulf of Mexico every year. It's getting bigger with time, but it's a deoxygenated area, which basically anything that swims into it suffocates. And they're very common. I mean, that's the big famous one because the Mississippi is such a big river. But a lot of the rivers around the coastlines all around the world have these areas of eutrophication, which is what it's called. And the ocean overall is losing oxygen. About, I can't quite remember the number. I think it's 2% per decade or something like that. It's a lot to the mid levels of the ocean. So so oxygen is the story of the ocean that we're not hearing about, but it is becoming very serious. Okay, so there's two other things that came through from, I guess, more mainstream news recently, aside from the heating, the heat bubble we talked about there. One of which is actually the occurrence of orca whales attacking boats off of Portugal. And one of my colleagues, whose partner is a marine biologist, was talking about or exploring how whale and orca migration routes are changing because of ocean temperatures and effects within the ocean. Have you any insights or thoughts in terms of what damage we're doing that's manifesting in these ways that haven't happened before? Well, I think that's the right way of looking at it, because what you're looking at is populations of animals that basically have their backs against the wall. You know, they had a way of life and a way of doing things, and all of this is being taken from them, either because their food moves, because it's hot, or because it's been overfished, or and now you've got species, and just like humans would be, if you put people under a lot of stress and threaten their livelihood and threaten their way of life, they get cross. And so I think it's very much a case here of not blaming the orcas, but asking what have humans been doing that has been threatening them so much that they can't just move somewhere else, because that's what an animal would normally do. It would just normally move itself to a safer place, and it can't do that. So I think it's important. One of the reasons for writing the book is that what we hear about a lot in in the news is we hear about all the bad things, and they are really bad, but they're presented without the context that lets us know what to do about them. It's like a doctor comes to you and says, "Oh well, your thing is wrong, and the thing they mentioned has a really long Latin name and you've got no idea what it is." And your reaction is, well, that sounds bad, but does that mean I should never eat broccoli again, or that I'm going to die tomorrow? And so the thing in the ocean is that if we don't understand how it works under the surface, it's just like, oh, that sounds bad. But actually, we do have the knowledge now to understand why these things are happening, and that means we can do something about them. And I think that's a really important message here, is the book is intended to be optimistic in the sense that knowledge is empowerment. And so, yes, there are plenty of problems that we're causing in the ocean, and there's the last chapter has a discussion of them. But the important point is that we can do something about every single one of these. We have the knowledge. This is not some great mysterious thing. We know how to do it. And we in the clean tech world, you more than me, I guess, we see that things are actually moving very quickly, and people feel depressed because they can't quite see it happening yet. But if you're behind the scenes where we are, you can totally see how quickly things are growing, and fine, they're not quite scaled up yet, but they are definitely on their way. Yeah. And so it's the same thing. Like we mustn't look at the oceans and think, oh, that's just really depressing, I'm just going to go home and cry. We have to look at it and go, let me understand what's going on, and then let me do something about it and change that. And so all these little stresses that we've, inflicted on the ocean and we haven't really noticed because we're not in the ocean most of the time. Yes, they are there. They are serious, and they are starting to affect us as well as what's in the ocean. But we understand what's going on. We can understand what's going on, and we can change our behavior. And we can change our attitude. And the biggest part about this is attitude. Because if you change your worldview, you make decisions based on that worldview, and then they're not hard decisions. So a bit of a shift of worldview, and a bit of a, just appreciation for a natural world, for these empty spaces, empty in inverted commas, that actually have the planetary engine inside them. Let's appreciate that planetary engine and let it be, rather than, using it up.
Yeah, no, it's a great way to end in terms of optimism, because that's one of the things that is challenging when you work in the clean tech sector. You've touched on things are happening massively fast, and it's really great, but you only hear the doom stories and sort of the consequences. Sometimes it's hard to be optimistic, but it's great to know that with knowledge and with understanding, with self-awareness, we do find ourselves in a more optimistic position. Final question was, which is the most interesting science-based podcast that you listen to or you would recommend?
That is a very leading question. I'm kind of between podcasts a bit at the moment. I'm not sure I would pick one. I do like BBC Radio 4's Inside Science, just as a really good, because their research is really solid, and they don't, they do it properly. They don't do it in a hurry. And actually, in the clean tech world, 39 Ways to Change the World, which is also a BBC podcast, is very good. I'm you've put me on the spot for what podcasts I listen to, because actually I try to listen to non-science podcasts, right, so I get everything else.
Get a more rounded view, yeah.
But I guess, and the Babbage from The Economist, the Babbage podcast from The Economist, I think. Alok's a friend, but I think he does a very, very good job on that.
Great. Well, we'll add those two, along with links to the book and to yourself and to your own sources and your TED Talks, etc., on the episode page. Helen, it's been great to spend some time with you. Look forward to those fully charged episodes coming up that you inferred in terms of looking again at some of the issues around the tech side of science. So for now, though, thanks very much for sharing your thoughts and your experiences.
Thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.